very pleased to say we now have an economics program at Ferris, an economics major, an economics minor. And one of the things we are all about at Ferris in our economics program is integrating economic thinking with things that most people think are kind of outside of the world of business and economics and finance. So last year we had a guest speaker come in and talk about the Ukraine war and life in the Soviet Union. This time we're having somebody talk about, was Jesus a socialist? So we'll, mixing economics and religion and politics a little bit, all the things you're not supposed to talk about at the dinner conversation. We think those are the most fun things and the most interesting things to talk about. So we'll encourage you to participate. We'll have a question and answer session afterwards. Just ask you a favor right now, make sure your phones are muted. Otherwise, I will turn it over here to Michael Steffens. He's with the Turning Point USA organization on campus, and he's going to be introducing our speaker. But first, I think he's going to also talk a little bit about the Turning Point USA organization. So, Michael, thank you.
Hello, everyone. So, for those of you who don't know me, I'm sure some of you do, as I spend a lot of time here in the business building. My name is Michael Steffens. I'm the president of the Ferris chapter of Turning Point USA here on campus. For those who don't know a lot about Turning Point USA, so we're part of a broad national organization. We have chapters on over 3,000 campuses all across the country. And so we go about spreading the importance of limited government, individual rights, personal responsibility, free markets. But most of all, our goal is to make advocating for these policies fun. Because this has been something that's been missing from these debates for generations, which is that it's boring, it's dull, it doesn't get people excited, it doesn't make people move. And so that's our organization's goal. Our goal is to change that. Because what we want to do is make it enjoyable to fight for our values. We want to build a space where young people can come together and can unite and make lifelong friendships around common values. So our success in this organization is going to rely on you, the student body, and our members of the community. And so my request from each and every one of you is to please consider joining us in making a difference. Because in order to continue having wonderful events like the one we're having tonight, we need more students to help make them happen. We are still a relatively new chapter. We are very small. And it does create a large strain on the few members we have to put on large events like this. And so we are looking for students who have the time to really chip in and help us make a difference. So we are having our next meeting after this at Tuesday, 5 p.m. in the UC, room 209. If you came to this event, you'll be getting an email about it. And I please encourage you to just show up and hear what we're all about. I promise you we'll have a lot of fun. And for those who really want to get involved, we do have several positions on our executive board open. And for those people, after our meeting on Tuesday, we'll be having a paid bowling night. So we're all going to go down to the gate, we're all going to go bowling for a few hours and have a lot of fun. And I should say, speaking of fun, so I should probably start introducing our speaker for the night. So our speaker is Lawrence Reed. He is the President Emeritus of the Foundation of Economic Education in Atlanta, Georgia. And he served as the president there for, I believe, 11 years. Prior to that, he is one of the founders and president of the Mackinac Center right here in Michigan. And he has been there for 21 years. And I believe he also served as a professor at Northwood for 7. And he is the author of 7 books, including the one this speech is titled after, Was Jesus a Socialist? And so without further ado, I present to you Mr. Lawrence Reed.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Dr. Watts. And thanks to the Turning Point chapter at Ferris State for having me here. And thanks to all of you for coming. It's great to be back in Michigan. I lived in this state for 30 years over in Midland until 12 and a half years ago when I moved to Georgia. But it's always great to get back, especially at such a beautiful time of the year as well. I was delighted to learn something that Dr. Watts just told you, that Ferris State now has a new econ major. And I just want to put in a word for that, being an economist myself and one who designed an econ major over at Northwood some well, 1978, I think it was, so it's been a long time. But an economics degree is not only very marketable and very functional, it also provides you with what we economists like to say is the economic way of thinking. It will change your perspective, and you'll look at the world in a different way, and I think in ways that will put you, in some cases, light years ahead of many others who are trying to figure out what's going on in the world. An economic way of thinking helps immensely to figure out and to explain what happens in everyday life, as well as in things like national policy. My topic tonight is, was Jesus a socialist? And I couldn't help but notice a gentleman in a clerical collar, and so as soon as I realized that, I thought, oh, I better do good. Do well, I guess. I'm sorry, I was not an English major. But it reminds me of the story of a man who passed away and got to the pearly gates where he met St. Peter. And St. Peter says to him, well, what do you most want to do while I'm up here? And the man said, well, you know, I used to give lectures all over America about the Johnstown flood. I'd love to talk about that up here. Can you rustle up an audience for me so I can talk about that great Johnstown flood? And St. Peter said, yeah, we can do that. But just a heads up, Noah will be in the audience. He knew something about floods. Was Jesus a socialist? Even though that's the title of my book as well as this speech, I always like to start out by explaining to people that I think that question is not fully appropriate, because it is an attempt to attach to Jesus a term that would not come into existence for 1,800 years after his crucifixion. And as is the case with its opposite, or what is often perceived as its opposite, capitalism, those terms have become freighted with baggage, and so you're never sure exactly what another person means by it. And I think it's more appropriate, and this is really the question I will address more specifically. Could you argue that the ethics and the teachings of Jesus were sympathetic to the ethics or the teachings or the foundational principles of what we call socialism today? That's really the question I want to look at. Or are they more sympathetic to what we think of as capitalism, or somewhere in between, or perhaps even are those questions irrelevant? I think to attach either word, capitalist or socialist, to Jesus is to limit him to but a fraction of who he was and why he came and what his message was. So I'm a little reluctant to say yes or no in answer to the question, as I would be if the question was Jesus a capitalist? I will argue, however, that I think, as an economist who happens to be also a Christian, that the ethics in the teachings of Jesus are not sympathetic to the ethics that underlie what we think of as socialism today. So it's important to begin with some kind of understanding of what socialism is. And you may have noticed that even among socialists, there's a common agreement that they won't all tell you the same thing or give you the same definition. If you ask them, what is it? What is socialism? There are some who think, well, it's sharing, and it's caring, and it's giving things to people. And whenever I hear such a superficial attempt at a definition, I'm always inclined to say, okay, well, sharing, caring, giving, I mean, those are pretty good things. But there's more of those things under capitalism than there is under socialism. Even when it comes to government foreign aid, you'll find that it is predominantly from countries that are largely capitalist to countries that are largely socialist. So and under capitalism, there seems to be a lot more stuff to share, a lot more stuff to give, a lot more philanthropy, a lot more the kind of thing that socialists like to say their system is all about. So I don't think that's a very good definition. Sharing, caring, giving doesn't get you very far in explaining what it is that socialism is all about. Mikhail Gorbachev, the last leader of the old Soviet Union, who just passed away 2 or 3 months ago, he made a statement once in which he said, quote, Jesus was the first socialist because he was the first to seek a better life for mankind. Jesus was the first socialist because he was the first to seek a better life for mankind. Well, when I heard that, I thought, was he? I'm guessing there were people before Jesus who would say, yeah, I'm trying to achieve a better life for mankind. But if that's all socialism is, just seeking a better life for mankind, then just about everybody is a socialist, right? Anybody here not want to see mankind live better? Well, wouldn't it be rather farcical for me to say, therefore, you must be socialist? I mean, I want to see mankind live better, and I don't consider myself a socialist. So I don't think Gorbachev had it either. Then there are some people whose definitions or understanding of it is so nebulous that they hop, skip, and jump from one place where socialism professes to be in place to another, always proclaiming, well, oh, this is it. Oh, no, it flopped. No, that wasn't it at all. Something else now. And we see this in Venezuela 25 years ago, before Hugo Chavez came to power. It was a very mixed economy. There was a lot of corruption, but they didn't have full-blown nationalizations of industry and price controls and confiscations of property as they have had under socialism. But a lot of Americans who were sympathetic to socialism at the time saw Hugo Chavez as kind of the second coming. Oh my gosh, he's going to make sure people are equal. He's going to make sure there is justice with socialism in Venezuela. A lot of those people now are not talking about Venezuela. They don't want you to talk about it. They certainly don't want you to point out that something went wrong, that about 15% of the country has fled, and the rest are living, on average, in misery and poverty. Venezuela went from one of the wealthiest countries in Latin America to now one of the poorest. And what made the difference was an official policy declared by the government of socialism. So a lot of socialists now kind of leave Venezuela behind and effectively say, well, we'll get it right the next time. Maybe we just got to get different people in charge and they'll do a better job. Which is a constant source of frustration for me, because as I talk with such people, I always want to say, don't you learn from these experiences? Don't just go from one to the next and not learn from the experience. And yet that often seems to be the case. I want to work my way to a kind of definition, or at least an understanding of what distinguishes socialism from capitalism or the market economy, as we often call it. And I'm thinking about a particular word that you cannot divorce from socialism. It describes socialism at its essence. And I'll work my way towards that by giving you a story. Imagine two Girl Scouts knock on your door. You open the door and they say, would you like to buy some cookies? You get to decide, in the typical situation, yes or no. That looks to me like capitalism. There's somebody invested in cookies, somebody's now marketing them, hoping to make some money. You have freedom of choice, you can buy or not to buy. That doesn't look like socialism. But if those two Girl Scouts show up the next day with a SWAT team, and when you answer the door, they say, you're going to buy these cookies. You're going to eat them. And you're going to like them. Or else. My contention is that looks a lot like socialism. What is the word that I'm driving at here that I think more than any other term describes the essence of the socialist idea? The word is coercion or force. Force. In fact, this is so symptomatic of the essence of socialism that I would go so far as to say that if it's voluntary, it's not socialism. If it's voluntary, it's not socialism. If you listen to people who call themselves socialists, from Bernie Sanders, of the democratic socialist variety, those are the folks who think that you can have the government control the economy and somehow still maintain political freedoms. That's very dubious, but that's their assertion. I find that the more socialist an economy becomes, the more it tends to undo the democratic elements that may have led a country in that direction. The more dictatorial it tends to become. But if you listen to people like Bernie Sanders, they don't offer a list of helpful tips for better living. Take it or leave it, your choice. If you listen carefully, you'll find they have a roster of programs they want to impose. They want to force you to participate. It's really telling when you look at in actual practice. You find that in capitalist countries that are relatively free in terms of their economy, you are free, for the most part, to practice at least some varieties of socialism if you want. There's the communal variety where everybody sort of produces and they put it all in a common storehouse and then it's distributed equally to everybody. That's a variety of socialism. You're free to do that under capitalism. You can do it now. Go around your neighborhood and ask all the neighbors, hey folks, let's take all of our earnings and put it in a common pot and we'll distribute it to everybody equally. Good luck. I don't think you'd have met very many who would say, yeah, count me in. I don't know why more socialists who profess to be in favor of that don't just go out and do it. But they don't want to do it unless they can force others to do it. And that's really what it takes to make it happen most of the time. You need to put a gun in people's head and say, no, this is not voluntary. This is what you're going to do. But under socialism, even though under capitalism you can practice that kind of socialism if you want, under socialism it's very difficult to practice capitalism. Let's say you live in a socialized country, and what would happen in most cases if you said to the government, oh, hey, thanks for your kind offer, but I'd rather not participate. I'd rather go my own way. I think I'll start a business, and that'll be the source of my livelihood. I don't need your goodies of any kind. I don't need your programs. I'd rather just be on my own. It's very difficult. In fact, the more socialist the country is, the more impossible that will be. Because socialists are not very tolerant of people who have a different viewpoint, who want to practice a different way of life. Or what's the phrase? A dance to their own drummer. I think I've mixed metaphors there, but you get the idea. Under socialism, there's a lot more compulsion. There's force, not voluntary cooperation. So you could disagree with me on that, but I want you to know up front, that's where I think socialism is coming from. But then the question really is, okay, well, what's the purpose of it? What's the purpose of concentrating power so as to deploy force against people? What's the objective? And I can identify three primary objectives for you of socialism. Okay, and these are in general terms. Different socialists may have different priorities. They might say, well, I put more emphasis on number 2 than number 3. But here are the three principal objectives that socialists attempt to achieve once they've concentrated power. One is the central planning of the economy. Now again, they may differ in terms of how intensely they practice it. Some will say, well, we won't plan everything. We'll let you do minor things, but the big picture, we want the government to plan. And they often say, if we leave it up to you, it'll be chaos. There won't be any plans at all, so we have to have plans. There have to be government plans. But as the Nobel Prize-winning economist F.A. Hayek pointed out, it's not a question of whether or not there'll be plans. Everybody plans. You plan if you create a business, you plan for your life, your family's life, and everybody's making plans. The question is, which plans will prevail? Will it be politicians' plans, or will they be your plans? Socialists don't create plans out of nothing. They simply replace personal plans for your life, your business, your family, with their plans and impose them at the point of a gun, effectively through the use of concentrated power in government. So that's one of the objectives. To one degree or another, to sort of plan the economy, as opposed to leaving it free to through spontaneous order, through the price system, the profit motive, self-improvement, and so forth, entrepreneurship to sort of blossom on its own. Another objective that socialists attempt to achieve is the government ownership of the means of production. And again, they'll differ among themselves. Some are more radical than others. Some want the government to own every plant, every factory, and The less radical ones say, well, no, just certain ones. The commanding heights of the economy, but we'll leave other fast food restaurants, we'll leave that in private hands. But the big important stuff should be owned and run by the government. And a third objective is the redistribution of wealth. That's a very key objective of many socialists. They want to redistribute wealth, not by request, not by voluntary consent, but by the force of government, because they think some people have more than they should and some people have less than they ought to, and that they can plan such things better than the spontaneous interaction of people in a free market economy. Those are the three objectives. Now, one time I had somebody in an audience say, oh, but you forgot, some of us socialists like worker control of factories. That's our kind of socialism. We want the workers to control the factories where they work. And when I hear that, I always say, well, okay, are you talking about workers going out and starting their own factories, making investments like the investors in the factories where they work did? Or are you talking about confiscating the factories where they work and turning it over to the workers? It's two very different things. Workers are free now as individual citizens. It happens every day of the week. To say, oh, I don't think I'll work for you anymore. I want to start my own. I want to get some other worker friends of mine together. We'll pool our capital and start a business. You can do that under capitalism. It happens every week. But it turns out when you press a socialist, what they really mean is, we really want to take the factories that are in existence, blow off the investors who created it, and put our guys in charge. That's really what we're thinking about. So socialism attempts to achieve one or more of those objectives in one degree or another. When I first heard the idea that Jesus was a socialist, this was more than 50 years ago as a teenager. At that time, socialism to me meant Eastern European countries that called themselves socialist, the Soviet Union. And what I saw there, I couldn't square with what I understood at that young age to be the teachings of Jesus. I saw lots of force and coercion and muzzling of the press and invasion of each other and sending armies across borders or arming subversives to take over countries. I thought, that doesn't sound very Christian to me. So I always have thought the claim that Jesus was socialist in his teaching didn't quite square with what I saw as socialism in practice. And really, I think you should put a great deal of weight when you're judging the merits or demerits of a system like socialism or capitalism. Put a great deal of weight on what the actual outcomes are. Not just the happy talk, because that's all that is, happy talk. What does it actually look like when somebody tries to put it into practice? We shouldn't judge things by happy talk, but rather by what actually happens. And I couldn't square Jesus' teachings with the socialism that I saw around the world. Now, I want to get more specifically into the teachings of Jesus and how they relate to this topic. I don't think that you can find, I stand to be corrected if I'm in error, but I have read the New Testament several times. I can't find any inscription, any message, any words of Jesus in the New Testament that suggest that he would endorse the concentration of earthly power in government for the achievement of any of those objectives that I've just listed. I never came across anything like, concentrate power in the hands of government and make sure the emperor has plenty of power over you. Nothing of that nature. There's nary a word in the New Testament that I could square in the teachings of Jesus with the ethics of socialism. I want to give you some examples that illustrate that and also make a case for just the opposite. Jesus said he came to fulfill the law. And we understand that to mean the Mosaic law, in particular the Ten Commandments. And I remind you that the 8th commandment says, thou shalt not steal. It does not say, thou shalt not steal, unless you're absolutely sure you can spend it better than the person who earned it. It doesn't say thou shalt not steal, but it's okay to hire a politician to do it on your behalf. It doesn't say thou shalt not steal unless the other guy has more than you do. There are no qualifications after that. And, you know, I wouldn't pretend to be in the mind of God to say why he produced the Ten Commandments in the order that he did, but in trying to explain the Eighth Commandment and 2 commandments later, I think maybe number 10 was meant to sort of shore up number 8. He may have thought, these human beings seem to have a penchant to take stuff. And so I'll tell them, thou shalt not steal, and 2 commandments later he says, and thou shalt not covet, which is often a reason for stealing. Somebody first coveting what belongs to another person and then making the jump to actually take it or hire somebody to take it for them. Both of those commandments seem to me to not only sanction, but support the concept of private property, which is not a socialist principle. Marx himself, the father of so-called scientific socialism, which is, I always thought that's a joke. Karl Marx pretended to be some kind of futurist soothsayer predicting where history was headed and what would happen, and I don't think he knew anything more about where the future was headed than anybody else. But he advocated against private property and said one of the principles of his form of socialism, communism, would be the abolition of private property. In Luke 12, 13 through 15, a man approaches Jesus with a request for a kind of redistribution. He approaches Jesus and he says, Master, speak to my brother that he divideth the inheritance with me. Speak to my brother that he divideth the inheritance with me. I see that as a kind of request for redistribution. He's saying, hey, I didn't get a fair shake. I should have got more. He got more than me. Can you use your influence and power to somehow correct the balance here? Get me more. Jesus does not reply to him with anything like, oh, you mean you didn't get an equal share? Oh, we'll have to look into this. Maybe you got cheated. What does he say to the man? He says, man, who made me a judge or divider over you? That's a pretty profound statement. Who made me? I mean, it's the Son of God. He says, who made me a judge or divider over you? I constantly wish that we get to the point someday when members of Congress can say that. You know, every request from the people to, hey, get me something at other people's expense, it would be great to hear a congressman say, who made me a judge or divider over you? And then Jesus goes on to say, take heed and beware of covetousness. For a man's wealth does not consist of the material possessions that he has. That's not something that socialists would likely say. Then there's the story of the Good Samaritan. I remember once being on a stage in Nassau, Bahamas, for a television show, and there were 2 guys on either side of me questioning me, and one of them said, Mr. Reed, you are for free markets, you call it capitalism. I said, yep. And then he said, but you're a Christian. I said, yeah. What, are you implying that that's incompatible? And he said, well, yeah, what about the story of the Good Samaritan, the parable of the Good Samaritan? Doesn't that suggest we need programs to help the disadvantaged? I mean, he leapt from the story of a man helping another to defending the welfare state. That's a pretty big leap, I think. But I had to remind him that the reason that that Samaritan was a good Samaritan is very important here. Because he didn't say to the man in need that he came across along the road, who was beaten and robbed, he didn't say to the man, you need to see your social worker, or I'll put in a word with the emperor for you when I get to Rome, or nothing like that. He immediately, of his own free will, decided to help the man with his own resources. If he'd done any of those other things, just blown him off and said somebody else will take care of it, or maybe there's a government program for it, we wouldn't know him today as the Good Samaritan. We'd probably be referring to him as the good-for-nothing Samaritan. But he helped the man of his own free will and with his own resources. That's the kind of personal involvement in assisting others in need that really tells you what's in your heart, you know. It's not enough, I think, for people to say, oh, well, I'm compassionate with the poor because I support those who say they are. Well, I think Jesus was a little more concerned with what was truly in your heart. Let me ask you this. If he came back today and spoke to this audience, and if he said to you, well, you know that I talked several times about being compassionate toward those in need. So, let me ask you, what have you done for the poor? If you raised your hand and said, I voted for politicians who said they'd take care of that, do you think he would be impressed? I think he would say, that's not what I asked you. I asked you, what did you do for the poor? Don't tell me what you asked somebody else to do on your behalf if you just blew the whole thing off. And you did it with stolen money? You wanted the politician to go rob Peter to pay Paul to do what I said you should get involved in doing? I don't think he'd be impressed if you said your way of helping the poor was to defer the duties of doing that to those with political power. Then you have the parable of the talents. Jesus told almost 40 parables, by the way, and they all have spiritual meaning. They're not, I identified 3 in my book that I thought could be seen as having some economic content. This is one of them. But don't overlook the spiritual meaning in each of them as well. But the parable of the talents involves a man who is leaving his estate for a time. He gathers 3 people together, 3 men, and he gives each of them a portion of his wealth. They're not equal, by the way. They're different amounts of each of the 3. So there's not egalitarian equality at the very start here. And he says, I'll check with you when I get back to see what you've done with what I've entrusted you with. And then Jesus has the estate owner call these guys together when he comes back and wants a reckoning. What did you do with what I trusted you with the talents, or form of money at that time? The first guy, I'm paraphrasing here, but he says basically, oh, you'll be happy with me. I have exactly what you trusted me with. I buried it in the backyard, and so I kept it safe for you. And the estate owner is actually angry with the guy. He's basically he responds basically by saying, what? You didn't do anything with it? You didn't husband those resources? Magnify them in any way? Heck with you. And then the second guy, he has him saying, oh, I turned it into, I don't recall exactly, but 2 or 3 times what you trusted me with. I invested it. He's praised in the parable for having magnified the wealth with which he was entrusted. And then he turns to the third guy and says, what'd you do? And the guy is probably very proud, and he says, oh, I got 10 times what you entrusted me with. He's the one that Jesus has the estate owner praise the most. Because effectively he's saying, wow, there's a guy who knows how to magnify wealth. That's a problem solver. That's an entrepreneur. That's a guy who knows how to make the world better off than he found it. In fact, Jesus has the estate owner say, he was so good at doing that, we're going to take the money from the first guy and give it to the third guy because he knows how to create wealth. I defy any socialist to tell that story with the same pride that I do, because I see it as an endorsement of things like voluntary wealth creation, the magnification of wealth, leaving the world a better place, at least materially, than you found it because of your efforts, your willingness to take risks, your use of material resources. There is a phrase in the Bible, or a sentence, that socialists like to seize upon, where Jesus says, render unto Caesar that which is Caesar's, and to God that which is God's. How many have heard of that? Okay, just about everybody. Very common. Context is important here, just so they can run to the Romans and say, hey, he's doing things he shouldn't, arrest him, shut him up. They produce a coin and ask something like, who does this belong to? What should we do with this coin, or whatever? And they're hoping he'll say something that they could say, this sounds like tax evasion. He's He doesn't want to give Caesar what Caesar says is his, so Romans ought to arrest him. That's what they're hoping he'll say. He responds in a very wise and clever way. More wise and clever maybe than you might imagine at first glance. He says, "Render unto Caesar that which is Caesar's, and to God that which is God's." Now, in your mind, does that clearly specify how much government can rightfully or should rightfully take from its people? Does that tell you how big government should be and when it crosses the line? It really doesn't. It kind of leaves that up to us. And in the process of saying that, he's sort of underscoring a kind of property rights. He's saying, look, if it is Caesar's, well, then give it to him. But maybe it isn't. He leaves that up to us. Socialists love to take that and say, he's actually saying whatever government wants for whatever purpose, you should pay it because he is endorsing government's power to tax to any degree and for any purpose. I don't see that. In my mind, as I read those words, I see a case for, if it's his, give it to him. Maybe it isn't, though. That's not incompatible with what Jesus said there. Maybe nothing is. In any event, that's an earthly matter for us to decide. Then you have the parable of the workers in the vineyard. This is a good one, where a man who owns a vineyard wants to get the grapes brought in, and he hires a group of workers first thing in the morning and agrees to pay them all a denarius, Roman coin at the time, for their work. And maybe around noon or so, he realizes, I've got to hire some more workers. I've got to get more people out in the field to bring the grapes in. So he hires another group to work effectively half a day, and he says, I'll give you each a denarius. And then late in the day, apparently he feels the need to get even more workers out there. He probably has to call some in who already worked for somebody else for a whole day. And he says, if you go out and put in an hour or two before dark, I'll give you a denarius. And then after that day, they all come together, and which group of workers is going to be rather unhappy? The first one, right? Because they're going to say, we worked all day for the same that you gave the guys who only worked half a day or even an hour. That's not fair. Well, in the parable, Jesus has the estate owner saying to them, it's my money. I'm free to do with it as I please. Didn't I do what I promised each of you? Didn't you voluntarily agree to the terms I proposed? And he basically says, get lost. I mean, I'm being honest with you. I'm giving each of you what I promised for what you did. I have a right to contract peacefully with workers, and that's what I did. Now, I don't know how a socialist could really grasp onto that and say that the economic lesson of that is in any way socialistic. It seems to me to sanction and reinforce things like voluntary contract, peaceful exchange, maybe even supply and demand. I'm guessing that maybe at the end of the day, the employer probably had to pay something more to get somebody to put in yet another hour or two who may have already worked already. Probably had to pay a little bit more, effectively per hour. So I have never seen how that parable could be construed to be a case for a socialist way of life. It seems to me to suggest just the opposite. Sometimes the socialists will say, well, what about Jesus driving the money changers from the temple? Doesn't that indicate he doesn't like people who seem to be so focused on money? And if you get a radical socialist, he may go a step further and say, well, that alone suggests he must be anti-capitalist. He's against these guys making money. So he drove them from the temple. But we don't know exactly what those money changers were doing, but there's some reason to believe that they may have been disrupting services. They may have been some dishonest perhaps in their dealings. But we do know this for sure. They were doing it at a location that dishonored the purpose of that location. You never see Jesus driving so-called money changers from a bank or from the marketplace. Where did he derive them from? God's house, from a temple. That doesn't mean he's against money or people who make money. He's just against certain activities in the wrong place. If you showed up at somebody's funeral with a kazoo and you start playing Happy Days Are Here Again, somebody's going to. There's a case or a story where a rich ruler, I think this is told in both Matthew and Luke, and it's in Luke that the rich man is identified as a ruler too, so he has some political connections, where he comes up to Jesus and effectively says, I'd like to join your group, and I want to have eternal life, and what do I need to do to have it? And you know that if Jesus was who he said he was, he knew the man's heart. And so he threw a little test at him. Not to all of mankind for the next 2,000 years, but to this one man. He said, okay, sell everything you got and follow me. And that's when the guy says, oh, no, can't do that. See you later. And then Jesus turns to, I think, a disciple next to him and says, it's easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter heaven. Some people say, see, now we got him. He's against rich people. Anybody who's got more than somebody else, he's somehow inherently evil. I don't see it that way. I see it as Jesus saying, keep your priorities in order. Don't let money rule you. You rule it. Don't worship money. Sometimes you hear people say, well, doesn't the Bible teach that that money is the root of all evil? This is a reference to something Paul said, but he didn't say money is the root of all evil. He said the love of money is the root of all evil. I actually think that's darn good advice. He didn't say, I'm against a medium of exchange which facilitates trade. And of course not. That would be ludicrous and difficult to defend. But the love of money is very different from money per se. Have you ever noticed how the love of money, the excessive and pursuit of it, is corrupting of people? I see it all the time, in Hollywood, in sports, every profession really. So few people seem to be able to handle great wealth when it comes their way suddenly and massively. All of a sudden, their life. You look at some of these folks, I don't need to name names, you all have seen this many times. But I'm thinking, wow, I'd like to think, maybe I'm wrong about how I'd react, but I'd like to think that if I came upon great wealth rather suddenly, I would be so grateful. I would be so thankful to God for making that possible. I certainly wouldn't let it rule me and corrupt me to where I'd have to break up my family or go on drugs or ruin my life over it. Money's just not that important. I think that's what is at work here. This is an admonition against not the good and healthy pursuit of wealth that solves problems and helps people along the way, but the obsessive worship of it. Money is not to be worshipped. Don't let it rule you. It comes with huge temptations. I think Jesus would say the same about power. I think he would say that, I can't cite a reference for it, but I'll bet if he were here and you said, well, what about the concentration of not wealth, but earthly power? You think that's a problem? I think he'd say, yeah. Certainly don't worship power. His message was not to tell you that it's power you should worship, politicians or the concentration of politics in your life. He was more interested in far more fundamental things in your heart than he was any of those earthly pursuits. I didn't mention about some of the early Christians. This is in the book of Acts, are recorded as practicing a kind of communal socialism. Some early Christians decided that what they wanted to do was to put their wealth together commonly and distribute it amongst themselves equally as they went about proselytizing for the new faith. And some socialists love to say, early Christians, they practiced socialism, so therefore this must be a biblical mandate. But this is not from Jesus himself. He never said this is how you should organize your economic affairs. Some Christians chose to do that. Most Christians, maybe 95% of all Christians who have ever lived,
have not practiced that. I don't think they're any less Christian. You know, the Pilgrims tried it at Plymouth for the first couple of years because of the contract they had with their English investors. The English investors wanted the Pilgrims to be successful in the colony, and they thought, mistakenly, that the way for them to be successful is to grow what they could, put it in a common storehouse, and have it distributed equally amongst them so they all get something. But Governor Bradford of the colony, within 2 years, scrapped that whole system. And you can read his own words about the effect of it. He threw it out and instead put in its place a private property arrangement where he said, now, the land isn't commonly held now. We're going to divide it up in plots and it's yours. You can sell it. You can grow what you want on it. You can sell it for whatever you can get, but it's yours. You're responsible now for the stewardship of that property. And he records how it made all the difference in the world in the colony's ability to feed itself. He records how, under the old socialist arrangement, there were colonists, all of whom professed love for each other, but there were some who thought, well, why should I work if the other guy gets just as much as me? So I'll let him show up early and work in the fields, and I'll do something else, and we get the same thing anyway at the end of the day. That's not a prescription for productivity. It's a prescription for consumption of wealth, not the production of wealth. It's a prescription for starvation. And Governor Bradford had to change it for the colony to survive. So, yeah, some early Christians practiced that. It died out for the most part, not very long thereafter. It was never coercive. It was not. The state was not involved in any way. And sometimes you hear people say, well, what about Ananias and Sapphira? They were struck down. They were struck dead over this issue. And you look a little more carefully and you realize it wasn't their reluctance to follow the policy. It was their desire to lie about it, to lie about how they had handled their wealth. That's why they were struck down. At this early stage, it was so important for Christianity to put down roots of integrity because it was going up against Roman authorities and a great deal of public skepticism, hostility. They didn't want anybody able to say, oh, this is just a cult and they're just trying to make money or whatever. You had to be clean as a hound's tooth among the early Christians, and I can see why. Well, I need to work toward a conclusion here, but I mentioned earlier that it's important to judge systems like socialism and capitalism by outcomes, actual outcomes. And they're never perfect because we are imperfect. We can always improve whatever outcome we may face under any system. But there is a pretty strong pattern to observe when you look around the world and compare countries, on the one hand, that have a relatively free or capitalist economy, and on the other hand, countries that are relatively unfree and have a socialized economy. You don't find very rich, hardcore socialist countries and very poor, strongly capitalist countries. That's pretty rare. I can't think of any exceptions. If you look at the Index of Economic Freedom, it comes out every year that rates 180 countries according to how free or how capitalist their economies are, and also where they stand in terms of standards of living. The pattern is pretty clear. The countries that are most capitalist, though they have plenty of problems, they nonetheless live at far higher levels than the countries at the other end of the scale. And if you're thinking, well, what about Scandinavia? Bernie Sanders says Scandinavia is socialist and they're pretty rich. Poor Bernie is 40 years out of date. What Bernie doesn't know is that, yeah, in the middle part of this last century, Scandinavian countries started drifting towards a socialist welfare state approach. They've all largely abandoned that, scaled it back, and in fact now, at least Denmark is ahead of the United States in terms of the degree of economic freedom or capitalism, freer than the United States. The Danish Prime Minister recently said, when somebody said, Bernie Sanders says you're a socialist country, he kind of blew up at him and said, we're not a socialist country. We have globalized free trade economies. We have low taxes on capital formation. We have more school choice than you have in the United States and so forth. Don't call us socialists, and yet Bernie still repeats that from 40, 50 years ago. But look at the index of economic freedom, and Sweden, Norway, Denmark, the 3 Scandinavian countries, and sometimes thought of as Scandinavian, but technically not, Finland. They're all among the top 30 or so freest economic countries in the world. They're not at the other end of the scale. It's like countries like Cuba, and really at the deep end would be North Korea. But you have a lot in between that are considerably socialized and tend to be poorer the more socialized they are. So I can't imagine that Jesus would advocate for a system that produces that kind of outcome time and time and time again. So you may not believe that Jesus was a capitalist. Again, I don't think either term does him justice, because he came here for so many other far more important reasons than to identify with an economic system. But I think you have to come away, when you look at the things that he said, wondering how you can square his teaching that is so rooted in personal choice, voluntarism, even the matter of where your soul is bound is a matter for you to decide, not the state's. How to square that with earthly socialism is, I cannot see it, do not understand it. So I hope that's helpful, and if we have time, I'd be happy to take some questions.